It's July 15th, 1945. The USS Indianapolis is making her way from Mare Island Naval Yard in California to Hunters Point Naval Yard in San Francisco. 3 days prior, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III had been given surprise orders to make a speed run from Hunters Point to Tinian Island to deliver a secret cargo. All she's been told about the cargo is that every day shorter the trip is a day off the war. The Indy had been in Mare Island since the Battle of Okinawa, where she took a kamikaze plane hit to the deck, the port side deck. The men were able to go out there and push the burning wreckage off. Before it had hit, it released a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb that went through the decks, through the hole, and exploded under the ship, loosening rivets, damaging the water distillery, and damaging the screw shafts. She was able to make her way on her own power back to Mare Island, and she had her overhaul, and now she is starting her trip. She arrives in Hunters Point, where there's normally 12 to 15 ships in different states of repair, and it is a ghost town. There's nothing there. Shortly after she docks, a couple of military trucks pull in. They pull alongside and lift off their cargo covers, and two men grab onto boards, two long boards that has a cylinder connected to the center, and two large men grab onto that and carry it up into officers' country, into Captain McVeigh's private quarters, and they rivet it to the deck. So it is fastened to Captain McVeigh's deck in his cabin, and they put a marine detail at the door at all times. As this is going on, a crane lifts a 5-foot by 5-foot by 15-foot wooden crate, lifts it up onto the quarterdeck, and they push it into the hangar, and they rope that off with 30 feet of rope and put a marine detail on that. Two weapons specialists join them for the trip, and the next morning the Indianapolis pulls out into the San Francisco Bay and pauses. At the same time, in New Mexico, the Trinity test is successful, the first nuclear bomb explosion, and shortly thereafter the Indianapolis is met with a boat that gives them orders, and the orders are to proceed with the speed run. The orders are by the President of the United States. And 10 days later they arrive in Tinian. They had made one stop in Pearl Harbor just for fuel and stores. Nobody was allowed on or off the ship in San Francisco or in Pearl Harbor, and they made their trip to Tinian. When they got to Tinian, they anchored a mile off ashore. Boats came out with brass from every branch of the military, and they watched the cargo be unloaded, and they disappeared. Captain McVeigh's new orders are to go to Leyte, report to Rear Admiral McCormick on the Idaho for refresher training before he goes to the front in Japan for the invasion that is set for December tentatively. Captain McVeigh decides that he's going to go at 16 knots. They have a 17-knot speed limit for non-emergency trips to conserve fuel. He decides on a trip leaving Saturday morning so that he can arrive Tuesday morning in Leyte. They leave on Saturday, and it's uneventful. Sunday comes around. It's a normal Sunday. The men have their church services with Father Conway, Dr. Lewis Haynes, and the pharmacist mate John Schmook. They are giving out cholera shots to all the men throughout the day, and business as usual. Captain McVeigh's pretty happy. He's allowed to get some gunnery practice in as he's on his way to Leyte. Around 7 at night, some information came across, some intel, that Lieutenant Charles McKissick, officer of the deck from 6 to 8, he received the information, said that there was a sub-sighting south of their route, but that they would probably run into that area on Monday. He talked to the supervisor of the watch and to everybody else on the bridge, and they decided it was, business as usual. These come up all the time, and they just proceeded with the course and did not even mention it to Captain McVeigh. Captain McVeigh came on to the bridge at about 7:30 before McKissick had left, and he told them at twilight you can stop zigzagging. The weather was bad, and he knew that when it got dark it would be bad enough that he didn't need to zigzag. So he said when twilight hits, stop the zigzagging, and then he left the bridge. Captain McVeigh returns to the bridge at about 10:30, goes over the 8 to 12 watch orders, makes any changes, signs off on them, goes over the watch with Commander Stanley Lipsky, the gunnery captain. He is the supervisor of the watch, and he is actually training Lieutenant Richard Redmayne, who is the new chief engineering officer. And there's a few others on the bridge. Captain McVeigh signs the orders, and he goes to turn in at around 11 o'clock. Around 11 o'clock, about 60 meters under the ocean, miles away, the I-58 submarine from the Taman group, a group of 6 subs of the Japanese that are out to sink any ship that they can run into, which is new for them as they only did search and rescue for their downed planes and their ships. They are now on a mission to sink anything they can. And it is below the water, and the men per orders wake up Commander Matsutsuro Hashimoto, and he orders them to their stations. He is told that they have monitored and picked up a noise about 12.5 miles away, 13 miles away, and when it gets to 12 miles away, they can recognize what the noise is. They know it's coming towards them, and they know it's dishes rattling. So 12 miles away from this sub, the sonar man is picking up dishes rattling in one of the Indianapolis's galleys. Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto orders the sub to periscope depth, and they come up to 60 feet below the surface, and up goes the periscope. He checks the horizon at 360 degrees, can see nothing, so he orders the sub to surface. The navigator Tanaka and another gentleman step out onto the bridge once they're on the surface, and they're looking with binoculars all around, and Tanaka says he sees a smudge against a dark sky, and he announces that he sees something, which brings Hashimoto up with his binoculars, and he's checking it out, and he can't believe that he didn't see it from his periscope, but he does see just a smudge against a real dark sky behind it, and he can tell that it's a ship of some sort, and he orders the sub to dive. Within a minute, they're in the sub, the hatch is sealed, and they are below the surface. The ship is coming on, and he is trying to figure out first what kind of ship it is and an attack plan. And this is very critical work and very fast work. His sonar man is monitoring the screws, the propellers on the Indianapolis, trying to figure out their speed. They use a staggered screws so that they're doing different RPMs to throw that off. At first they think they're doing 20 knots, then they drop it down to 12 knots when they adjust when it gets closer. Commander Hashimoto sees that it's coming straight at them, and now he worries for a second that it's a destroyer that's seen them. But he knows that that's not the case. He can only pick up one craft, which is unusual. So he orders a series of maneuvers that puts them to the starboard side of where the ship is coming, and he wants to end up 2,000 meters out from the starboard side of the ship. He orders 6 torpedoes into the tubes. He wants them staggered, fanned out at 3 degrees apart with 2 degrees between the 2 center ones. Having made his maneuvers, Hashimoto keeps his eye on the small blot, which eventually turns into a triangle, and soon it turns into a view of a tall mast, and he says he makes out a fore and an aft gun, and he knows that he's got a battleship coming. His crew are all excited on hearing this news. He changes up his targeting. He sets his distance for 1,500 meters, and they set and they wait. Now they wait for the Indy to approach. As soon as it gets into sight, Hashimoto orders a fire. In 15 seconds, all 6 tubes are shot, and there's 6 torpedoes with 1,200-pound warheads heading at the ship. It's going to take about a minute to get there, and he's staring through his periscope. He's looking, and he looks, and first he sees a tower of water shoot up at the front of the ship, right at the bow, followed by an explosion and fire. 2 seconds later, another huge tower of water shoots up just in front of the bridge, behind the gun, the fore gun. So in between the gun and the bridge, the water shoots up and another explosion, and then he thinks that he sees explosions everywhere. He lets his men watch through the periscope, take a look, and they're all looking. His sonar man, because of the explosions, some of the men said it was a depth charge attack, but he assured them, no, that's not what it was. It was explosions of the ship they had just torpedoed. And then his sonar man said that he detected that they were using underwater detection gear. So Commander Hashimoto ordered a deep dive and to reload those 6 torpedoes. This maneuver is going to take over an hour, and in this time that ship is not going to be seen again. At about 11:30, Dr. Lewis Haynes is standing at the mess hall watching the men play poker. They invite him to join the game. He declines after the long day of giving out the cholera shots, and he goes and retires to his bunk. He's almost asleep when he says he saw a flash outside of his porthole, and all of a sudden he was blown up in the air off of his bed and onto the deck. He scrambled to his feet, and just then he was knocked to the floor again by the second hit. Knowing that they were under attack, he grabbed onto a pair of dungarees, threw them on, and prepared to run himself out of the room. When he got out of the room, there was a big flash of fire that came down the hallway. He had to have his arm up. There was a gentleman in front of him, and he got his head burned and around his hand burned, so he got a pretty good burn to his arm. He said there were third-degree burns to his face and his skin from that. And he made his way. He had to make his way above decks. Right now he's the first floor below deck, and he needs to get topside before they dog down the hatches. He's making his way through. He gets to a wardroom, and there's smoke and fire in the room. It's difficult to breathe. There's not much oxygen. Somebody yells something about a porthole, and he runs over to a porthole, and it's open, so he sticks his head out. And as he sticks his head out, he's looking down, and he can see the hole in the steel and things pouring out into the ocean. Desks, people, dead bodies, all pouring out into the ocean, so he cannot jump. He was thinking about abandoning ship at that point. Then he gets hit in the face by something wet, and he looks up, and it's a rope. It's a rope from the quarterdeck that's on one of the lifeboats. He checks the sturdiness of it. It holds his weight, so he squeezes his way out of the porthole, climbs up to 5 feet even with his burned hand, and gets over the quarterdeck and makes his way to the hangar, which is now being used, where pharmacist mate John Smook is administering morphine shots to the badly wounded and treating the others. It's turned into a triage unit in the hangar bay now. Lieutenant Richard Redmayne, after his watch ended at midnight, he went up to the top deck to use the officer's head, and while he was in there, the torpedoes hit. The second torpedo hit just in front of the bridge, and he could hear and smell the fire and hear it the flames licking outside the door. Knew he shouldn't be inside there anymore, so he had to get out of there. He covered his face with his arm and bust through the door to get out, and when he got out, he tripped and he fell to the deck, which was still hot from the flames that came up, and singed his hand, burned it very bad on the deck, and his arm and his face was burnt by the flame underneath coming up. He was able to get up, and he was going to make his way down to his station, and his station is the engine rooms. Makes his way down to the engine rooms, and the first engine room, the fore engine room, is on fire, and there's nothing that's going to be done in there, so he makes his way to the aft engine room, which is in good working order. He gets in there and finds out that the 1 and 2 screws, which are the outside screws, they're not working. They're controlled from engine room 1. Screw number 3 is losing its pressure, so he orders screw 4 to be put to full rotation. So shortly after that, it's doing 160 RPMs, the large screw, the only one that's working. Not knowing if he should do that, not knowing if they were torpedoed and they should keep going, or if it was an explosion and they should stop the ship to stop from keeping on water, he ordered them to put the screws at full blast, and then he headed up to go and get the orders from the bridge, as communications had been knocked out and there was no power from just behind the bridge forward. So no power to the front of the ship and no communications anywhere. Captain McVeigh is knocked from his bed up into the air and lands partly on his dresser. The second torpedo hit knocks him to the floor. He gets up, and the first thing he does is make his way down to the bridge. Completely naked. It's completely dark, white smoke everywhere. He makes his way into the bridge. Nobody can see who anybody is. The only way you can tell is by getting their names. He asks his supervisor of the watch, John Orr, the status of the ship, in which he's told that the power is out from there all the way to the front. There's no communications with anybody, let alone the engine room, because Orr wants the engine stopped so that they stop taking on water. They don't know it, but the front 40 foot of the ship, the bow of the ship, has been blown off. It's approximately 40 feet. It's on an angle a little bit, but the front of the ship is gone, and the faster they're going into the 15-foot swells, the faster that water's filling the ship. They can feel that it's not riding right. They can tell that it's not lifting up in the waves and it's nosing down into them. So they know that something's wrong, but they can't see past all the smoke and the darkness to see out to see that the front of their ship is gone. The other torpedo had ripped a huge hole in the side, and she was taking on water on her side, causing a list at the start about 3 degrees to starboard. And Captain McVeigh ends up telling Officer Janney to go down to the radio room and make sure they get off an SOS, telling location and telling them that they're sinking fast. So Officer Janney goes and heads to the radio room. Captain McVeigh is waiting for his damage control officer, Casey Moore, to get back from taking an assessment and going along and getting the word up to get the men up from below deck. As he's waiting, he decides he's going to go back to his cabin and put on some clothes. Captain McVeigh makes his way back to the bridge, getting dressed along the way. Once he's back, Casey Moore, his damage control officer, shows up and tells him that he's having trouble locating the repair teams that are along the ship that are there to dog down the ship and fight the flooding, keep her afloat. He was able to pass the word aft of the bridge for the men to get topside, but he wasn't able to pass the word forward of the bridge because the mess hall was on fire and it was taking on water. He asked the captain if he wanted to abandon ship. The list was about 12 degrees at about this point, and the captain figured that they could still save it and said, no, not yet. Go back below and see what you can do about finding the repair teams and get more people up top. Dr. Lewis Haynes is administering morphine shots and he's running low, so he sends a gentleman to the med bay to be able to get some. He returns quickly to tell him med bay is underwater, and with that news, Haynes knows that the ship is going to go down, and he orders the man to go get life jackets. Shortly after that, Schmook and this gentleman return with their life jackets, arms full of life jackets, and they start putting them on the wounded. Some of them badly burned, so bad that they're putting the jackets on are taking the skin off of them, but they have to get the jackets on them or they're going to pass away when the ship goes down. They get the jackets on. No sooner they get the jackets on than the ship rolls on a bigger tilt, and Haynes could do nothing but watch the wounded, beds, men just slide down into the ocean. He saw one man gripping at his leg, at a cast on his leg, before it just dragged him underwater to his death. So they got the preservers on some of them before they hit the water, but not all of them. And all he could do, now the list on the ship was about 60 degrees, was climb to the high side of the ship as they're taught to leave the ship. He climbs up to the high side of the ship, climbs up over the railing, and he's standing on the hull of the ship. He sees nothing but a sea of men. About 400 men are standing on the side of the ship with them, and they just quietly start walking into this ocean. They just walk right off of the ship and meet the water just past the red mark of the paint on the hull. At about this time, Richard Redmayne had made his way close to the bridge when that last tilt to 60 degrees hit. He was making his way up to the high side to evacuate off of the high side of the ship, so off of the hull. And when that last jostle hit that knocked it from 60 degrees to 90 degrees, he was knocked through a porthole, bounced off the deck, and somersaulted or cartwheeled right over the railing into the ocean. So that's how he got off the ship. And he ended up joining up with a group pretty much led by himself and Harlan Twibble. Harlan Twibble was brand new out of Annapolis school, and he was an ensign. And he was doing his best to lead the men. He tried to get them, he was on the low side of the ship where they're taught not to go off of the ship because it has a tendency to roll over on you or it could suck you down easier. But they had nothing they could do. 300 and something men standing at the railing, and some of them stepped off into the water without even getting their hair wet. They all left the ship at the same time as Redmayne, probably just after the Haynes group, within a minute of the Haynes group leaving. So the ship had turned on its side, and they're all into the water on both sides. Giles McCoy, he ends up making his way up and into the near turret 1. It's about the only dry spot on the ship, and basically the center of the ship, and he's waiting to go down, and he wants to jump, but there's too many bodies in the way, so he's going to wait a little bit until it gets closer to the time to be under, and then he's going to get off. There's men all over the fantail. As the fans, if the tail starts lifting out of the water, there's hundreds of men on the fantail, maybe 200 men on the fantail of this ship. Some of them end up standing on the screws waiting for it to go down, so they're standing on those propellers that aren't on. That fourth screw, once it comes out of the water, that screw is spinning and people that are jumping, some of them are being hit and diced up, tossed by it. Men are being hurt by that screw that is still turning once it leaves the water. Just before the screws left the water, Captain McVeigh made his way up onto he was climbing down himself to go to the radio shack when it did the last tumble. He made his way up onto the hull. It was empty at that point. There was nobody on the hull. He was standing basically at the middle of the ship. The back of the ship was already out of the water, and as the water, there was a wave that comes along as the front of the ship sinks that just gently washed him into the water. As he was in the water, he looked up and he could see the fantail lifting up. He saw the screw spinning. It was over his head, and he was thinking, just like many of the sailors that were in the water at the point, that the ship would fall on them. But it wasn't going to fall on them. It was preparing to make its final dive. Men were still all over the fantail, as I said, and the ship was still moving. It was moving about 3.5 miles an hour even when it sank. It was still moving forward. So it stood up on the end. One of the men that were further away that were able to see it, some men were too far away. They got off the ship too soon, miles back, to be able to see it sink. But the men that did see it sink said that there was just hundreds of men up on the fantail, and when the ship finally started going down and disappeared in the water, they spread out like bugs. So they all had to fight, I'm sure, against the suction, as many of the men that left just before it went under had to do. One of them being Giles McCoy. He ended up getting off, and he was swimming as hard as he could, and suddenly he felt something tug at his foot, and then it tugged at his leg, ripped his shoe off, and then he was being tugged down. He was grabbed by the suction of the ship, and he was pulled down so far that he almost blacked out, when suddenly a greenish oxygen, like an air bubble, lifted him up to the surface. It must have came out of the ship as it settled down in the bottom, and it lifted Giles McCoy up to safety, because he was in bad trouble with that one. One of the men that stepped off the ship without even getting his hair wet was Felton Outland, is his name. He was able to step off the railing as it was so level with the water that he was able to not even get his hair wet, but he too was sucked down. Everybody in the water looked the same. They were covered in black oil, so all you saw was the white of their eyes and the red of their mouths. Everybody looked the same. You couldn't tell one from the other. Officers didn't know officers. Nobody knew anybody else, and everybody is now in the water. Captain McVeigh is now swimming, and he runs into a potato crate, which he's able to get on and straddle to keep him afloat, and he looks over and he can see 20 yards away there's 2 life rafts that are tied together. And he swims over to these life rafts and climbs aboard, and shortly thereafter he hears voices, calls out to the boys to swim to him, and about 3 boys get there, and he helps them into his rafts. It's just the 3 of them, and suddenly they hear another set of voices, and they can see a raft about 1,500 yards away, and one raft has 1 boy in it, and another raft has about 5 people in it, and they're going to paddle over to the raft with the 1 boy in it, but they're too tired, so they just sit there and rest. Lieutenant Redmayne gets to the surface, and he notices that he's close by a raft, swims over and climbs aboard. He is in the raft with a few other men. The raft is not alone. There are 2 or 3 rafts. I think there's 3 rafts that end up with them. There's 5 floater nets, and the floater nets have about 50 men on each of them. 4 of them have wounded men on them, so 200 men or so are wounded on 4 of the floater nets. And the 5th floater net they use for the healthy men that are helping others during the day to be able to rest. So they have all kinds of flotation devices. They also have rations of food. They have water breakers. They have just about everything you need to survive, but they're not going to dole out any of the food until at least Wednesday, they're planning. Nobody's in charge of this group. There's probably more officers in this large group than there is in any group. Redmayne's in there, his assistant chief Benton, there's Harlan Twibble, Ensign Blum. There's quite a few officers, but nobody's taking charge because it's not a cohesive group. They're not working together for survival. There's no real leadership going on early on in the Redmayne group. Dr. Lewis Haynes ends up in the largest group of boys. 400 boys are in this group with Captain Park from the Marine Detail and Father Conway. The three are instrumental in herding these boys together. They get them together and Captain Park tells them to sound off, and one by one the men start sounding off and it reaches the number 400. So they have 400 boys in this group and he orders them to tie their jackets together. And they go ahead and tie their jackets together, and the men put their legs around the men in front of them, their arms around their waist, and they all lean back. So they're kind of leaning back on the person's chest in front of them. Their head will rest on their chest. And they laid like this, and the men that were not on the outside, they all gathered on the inside along with Dr. Lewis Haynes. He was inside of this ring. And the ring stayed like this, and shortly after that, people were screaming for a doctor. Dr. Lewis Haynes did not want to let them know who he was at the time. Nobody knows who anybody is. Everybody's in oil. And finally he comes forward and after a couple shouts and says, yeah, I'm a doctor. And he goes and checks on the first person they want checked on, and this is his good friend Stanley Lipsky, gunnery officer. He ended up getting burnt so bad that his hands were burnt down to the tendons and his eyes were too charcoal. They just looked like charcoal, his eyes did. So he got burnt very severely. He blindly made his way down ladders to the decks to order the boys to get off the ship, to abandon the ship. So he did an incredible job, especially in the state that he was in. Haynes gets over there and sees that the boys are holding him up out of the water. He's burnt everywhere and they're holding him up out of the water. So they're all swimming to keep him afloat and keep him out of the salt water as much as they can. But there's nothing Lewis Haynes can do for him. He can't do anything for anybody, basically. He has no tools, and it's going to be salt water that's going to be doing most of the damage, and sharks. Not much he's going to be able to do except be a comfort to the men as they're passing away, and that's what he ends up being. He says he turned from being a doctor to a coroner when that ship went down. Dr. Haynes turns to go help the other boys to try to comfort them, to try to soothe them. Same thing Father Conway is doing, swimming boy to boy, trying to calm them down, trying to soothe them with his speaking and his presence. And at the same time, Captain Edward Park and other sailors are helping round up people that get outside of the group. The waves will push a guy out and they'll go and round him up and bring him back and keep everybody safe that way. And this is how they spent the majority of their first morning in the water. Giles McCoy, as soon as he surfaces from his air bubble, sees that he's in a mass of men and he's by a wounded boy, and the boy is swimming next to him and says, I'm having trouble swimming, I need a jacket. He says, I can see that. So a dead body floats by and he's able to, Giles grabs onto the dead body and pulls it close, takes the jacket off and hands it to the boy. At the same time, he hears people yelling that they have a raft. And he wants to swim over to the raft. So he starts swimming, but the oil is 1 to 2 inches thick, and he can't go anywhere wearing the soiled life preserver he has on. So he figures, screw it. He takes his life preserver off, hands it to the kid, says, give this to somebody who needs it. And he goes below the surface and swims, coming up for air every 10 or 15 feet. He finally makes it over to the boat, over to the raft, and grabs on to the tether from the raft and loses all his energy and starts to sink. And right then somebody grabs him by the hair and pulls him up and onto the raft. And he goes ahead and retches out his oil and salt water and notices he's on a raft with 4 others that are in pretty decent shape. The raft is with a couple other rafts with Mike Carilla and others on it. So there's 3 rafts together. They got about 12 men in the 3 rafts. And Giles McCoy decides that he's not going to sit around and do nothing. He's going to clean his gun. He goes ahead and takes it apart, handing 1 piece to each person in his raft. He goes ahead and takes his oily shirt and rubs it along his components of the gun, puts it back together, chambers around, and declares the gun is clean. And then he and the other men see what they think is a ship, a big dark shape that's sitting off in the water, and he fires a shot at it. Then he fires a second shot at it. Then he thinks, what if that's a sub? Turns out that was the sub. It was the I-58. It had returned. She was down for about an hour, and Hatsumoto had them go ahead and surface, and they were doing a search. They wanted some proof. Hashimoto wanted proof that he had sunk the ship, so he wanted to get a couple of survivors, while Tanaka, his navigator, wanted to strafe the survivors with a machine gun. Shortly after daybreak on Monday morning, two things happened with the swimmer group. One is they drift themselves out of the oil slick, and the second is that they split up. The 400-man group that started out now split up into 3 splinter groups that stay a couple hundred yards away from each other the whole time from here till rescue. The largest being 200 men, and that one is led by Captain Ed Park of the Marine Detail. And there's also Father Conway and Dr. Lewis Haynes in the 200-man group. There's another 100-man group and one about 50 men. So they lost about 50 men due to injuries over the night. They're left with 350 men. The 200 men that are with Captain Park end up having Park find a life preserver ring that had 100 feet of rope from it. And he ordered the men to grab onto the rope and the man next to him to grab onto it right next to him. And what it ended up doing was forming a circle. It naturally circled itself back on itself, and Captain Park ordered Dr. Lewis Haynes in the center of the group along with the wounded. And this is how the 200-man group would stay for the rest of the day. The Red Main Twibble group this Monday morning, they start out the day trying to get some semblance of leadership going amongst them. Leading the way is Ensign Harlan Twibble. He's 23 years old, straight out of Annapolis. He's been with the ship 2 weeks. He's trying to tell the men, go ahead and kick off your shoes, go ahead and tie your life jackets together, and nobody's listening to him at all until finally an old salt, a gunnery officer, tells him, you heard the officer, now do it. And they finally listen, and as Jack Miner, he's in a daze still from the way that he ended up leaving the ship, but he kicks his shoes off, and when he looked down, he saw something flash below his feet. Doesn't know what it was. Something was there, and then it wasn't. Captain McVeigh's group, early Monday morning, they're in good spirits. They ended up meeting up with another raft, so now they have 4 rafts, 10 people, and they have the raft spread out by about 75 feet as far as they can with the rope tying them off so that they can make the biggest target for planes to be able to see if they come overhead. They spent the day, they have rations, they have some malted milk balls. They have a breaker of water, although that breaker of water was contaminated with salt water and it's no good any longer. But they do have the malted milk balls, and there are things that are floating by, and they're picking things up out of the water. Ammunition cans, big cans that the ammunition is stored in, those are floating by. They're picking up what they want and what they think they can use. They actually have flares and a flare gun that are with most of the rafts. They ended up Captain McVeigh was on the bottom of the raft when he jumped in the rafts at first. Once he found out he was on the bottom of the raft, it was flipped over, and then they found the emergency equipment in there, which included a flare gun, had a couple other provisions in there, and actually had cigarettes in there, but they had no way to light it as the matches got wet, so they threw all of it overboard. They just got rid of it rather than go through the torture of having cigarettes and no way to light them. They spent their day. They ended up seeing their first plane at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Captain McVeigh fired off a flare at it to no avail. 10 o'clock that night, 10 o'clock at night on Monday, he shot a flare at it. So a nighttime flare. Plane didn't see it. Later in the day on Monday, Shark shows up to visit Captain McVeigh and his group of rafts. It is a large, they said, an airplane size oceanic white tip. The white on the fins were as white as a sheet of paper, they said, and this thing did nothing but just circle their raft. It circled their raft over and over and over, goes underneath the rafts, and the rafts are not like a solid bottom raft. These rafts are like, they're like a styrofoam, and then you have lattice, so little thin wood that forms the bottom of them. Some of them got damaged and were no good, and they have openings in them down there. Not very strong bottoms, so you're not really protected from sharks if sharks wanted to get you in those rafts, just like probably any raft. But this shark kept circling them, and it was a mainstay throughout the whole ordeal. The same 12-foot, they said it was a 12-foot oceanic white tip, and every time that they tried to fish, it would grab their fish that they caught. They were able to catch a couple fishes. There was a fishing kit that was in with the emergency provisions in the raft, but there's nothing they could do, as anytime they catch something if it wasn't the oceanic white tip that would grab it, some other shark would grab it. They did catch one triangular fish. John Spinelli was able to catch a triangular blackfish, but the captain was worried that it was poisonous, and he ordered him to throw that out. So the only fish they caught, they had to toss. Daytime on Monday, the Giles McCoy group of rafts, 4 rafts tied together, they spent the day banging each other's rafts together. McCoy thought that it was going to break his raft. His raft was already damaged. The lattice in the bottom that makes up the floor, the corner of that was broken off when it left the ship and hit the water, either or, got hit by debris, but the bottom was already destroyed on that, and he didn't want to hang out very much with these other 3 rafts because they kept being jostled together. Every time a wave would come, they'd bang together, and it was very uncomfortable. They spent the day like this, all 4 of them, rafts huddled together, and midday on Monday, near Monday at dusk, they started seeing sharks show up. They were seeing sharks down in the water. They weren't coming to bother them, but they were seeing the sharks, and it was the first time they had noticed the sharks. Not good news coming up for any of the men. There were 17 men on 4 rafts is the final count on the men that are with Giles McCoy at this time, and they spend their day basically just sitting there waiting for rescue that does not come. As night is approaching in the Haynes group, maybe not known to the men, maybe known to the men, but they are surrounded by sharks now. There are sharks all around them in the water, and they start feeling, as night approaches, they start feeling bumps to their legs. So whether they're on the nets when they're in the red main group, or whether they're in the swimmers group, they're all starting to feel bumps and some hits from below. And it's the start of what's going to become some bad news for these people. They haven't had a shark attack yet. Giles McCoy on Monday morning, first thing Monday morning, he looked over at a gentleman that was sleeping in the water, kind of leaned forward a little bit. He thought he was sleeping, and all of a sudden he disappeared under the water. And he waited for him to pop back up, but he never did. So that might have been the first shark attack from the Indianapolis that anybody witnessed, was Giles McCoy seeing that happen first thing Monday morning. But here we are Monday night, and the sharks are starting to make contact with the men. Not really attacking them yet, but they are doing the bumps. They are curious, and they're checking into them. The swimmer group, led by Dr. Haynes, the boys are all going through severe chills, severe chattering of the teeth. They're freezing. They've been in the water now for a day. It's 85-degree water. Our bodies are used to 98.7. Way too cold. The men are drastically dropping their body temperatures the more they're in the water, and they're going to get to a point where they hit hypothermia, and they're going to start losing their minds, along with some other things, if they don't get rescued soon. Along with this, they've been in the water for a day now. All those K-Pack jackets that they have on, their life jackets, are only good. They're only good for 2 days. So 48 hours is the time on those, and they've been in the water half that time. No sign of rescue, no sign that anybody has even known that they're there. And Lewis Haynes is just wondering how long it's going to be before the men just start losing their mind, and then he realizes that he's no different. He's in the water too. And the closer to the water you are, the worse off you are with the salt. You're going to take in more salt. If you're on a raft, you're not out of the water. Half of your body is still in the water, but at least you're not breathing in salt spray off of the water like you would be doing when you're down in the water. So a lot of problems coming up for the people that are not on rafts. Even the people that are on rafts are going to have some other issues. But the swimmers are going to go through the worst thing of the Indianapolis. It's just horrible what they're about to go into. And this night was the start of it. Chattering teeth. One boy had a rope from his jacket in between his teeth. He bit right through the rope with his teeth chattering. So that's how cold it was. The men were going into hypothermia. They had already gone into photophobia because of the bright light off of the sun. It's worse than snow blindness because when you close your eyes, it doesn't help. So Haynes had them cut strips of their clothes to cover their eyes with, but that just gives limited relief. These boys were just in a torturous situation, and already some were giving up their lives on their own. Some were just drowning themselves. They'd take off their jacket and they would sink. Some would just lean over in their jacket and just force themselves to drink the water, and suffocate in the water. Some would take off their jacket and swim out and let the sharks get them. So people were already deciding that they didn't want to hang out for this in droves. It was a lot of people that were just taking their own lives. And now on this night with the chattering men, they're all scared. They're all starting to worry about the sharks. Now they're pretty much know what's going on with being bumped in the legs. And they chatter themselves and freeze themselves to sleep. Tuesday morning in low light conditions, Giles McCoy looks over the side of his raft to see all the sharks down there and notices that they're spiraling up to the rafts. He says this is not going to be good. And this is the start of the shark attacks. In the swimmer group, you had people being bitten. They'd be sitting there and all of a sudden somebody would scream out. The sharks would go right up into the group and grab people. Sometimes it would grab people on the outside. Anybody that got away from the group now was in danger of being eaten by a shark. I mean, this is when you didn't want to leave the group. They're surrounded by hundreds of sharks in the swimmers group now. And the sharks aren't going up into the men very often, but they will go up there to grab them. So there's men screaming, there's blood everywhere, there's arms, legs everywhere around. Same thing's going on in the raft group. With the red main group, the sharks are going right up into the nets, lifting the men and the nets up out of the water. There's body parts all over the place in the red main group. Captain McVeigh's group, there wasn't a single attack that I know of, and in McCoy group, there wasn't an attack in that group either, but those are two small groups. But the red main group, the rafter group, and the swimmer group, which is the Haynes group, they both had it bad. So they make it through. It continues on. These attacks go on until it becomes daylight. When the low light conditions stop, those sharks spiral themselves back down out of sight, and they don't see the sharks the rest of the day. They figure that the sharks were eating on the dead people for the first day and a half that they were there, and now they come up, and this would turn into a schedule of theirs. The sharks would show up and they would spiral themselves up when it would get low light conditions. They would do some biting on the people, and they would spiral back down as soon as it was dark night or it was bright day. They liked the low light conditions, and they would come up and do their damage then, and they would swim through the wounded and dead throughout the day. So they only had attacks in the low light conditions, and the rest of the day it would go after stragglers or eat the people that were already attacked. Tuesday turned into a day of lost hope for the men. What they thought would be a quick rescue the day before, they were now starting to doubt a rescue at all. Some of them were still giving up on the chance of rescue, and they were taking their own lives. Others were just disgusted that they would do it. Some of the boys now wanted to start drinking water. They hadn't had water in over a day and a half now, almost 2 days, and they start talking to Dr. Haynes about ways they can drink the water. Can I hold the water can I cup it in my hands, hold it up to the sun? Will that get rid of the salt? And he said, no, it'll only make it saltier. You can't do that. So he's telling them all, you can't drink this water, because if they start drinking the water, that's the worst thing that can happen to them other than just being eaten by a shark. To drink that salt water is just as bad. Spend the day shooting off flares at planes that'll go by, cursing that they're not being rescued, talking about what they would do if they were back home. Some of them probably just trying to battle to fight to stay alive, to go ahead and keep going through this, I'm sure. So Tuesday was a tough day. Not a lot happened. Tried to do some fishing in the rafting group again with McVeigh. That didn't work. They still had their oceanic whitetips swimming around them. In the Giles McCoy group, they were down to 12 men. Doesn't sound like the sharks did that though. One of the men swam off, gave his money to Mike Carilla, and he swam off. Another one drowned himself. He was tied. He had his jacket tied to the raft, and he was gone. He was out of his jacket. And McCoy was looking down and saw the boy floating by like he was flying in the water, so he drowned himself. So somehow they got down to from 17 to 12 there. They were still at 10 men in McVeigh's group, and the group of swimmers and the Red Main group were about to go through the same thing they went through again. As soon as the low lake conditions hit on Tuesday night, they started getting into the sharks again. The men were going crazy. Some of them were so scared they would swim away. One of them swam away. One boy swam away from the group, and Bob Gauss went out and he went to go swim and recover the boy to help him not get eaten by the sharks. And as soon as he started swimming out, he saw a large fin start slicing through the water towards him, so he swam back to the safety of the group, and that boy was unfortunately eaten, just like many of the men. There was another group of swimmers, and this one was separated from the others. And Edgar Harrell is a Marine. He's another surviving Marine. He and Mike Spooner are the two Marines that were in that group that I know of, but it was about 80 men. There was no leadership in that group, and it kind of splintered off pretty quick, and the two Marines left on their own, and they ended up having to sit there as the sharks came at him. He would see, Edgar Harrell said he would see the fin coming at him at the top of the water, so it's coming straight at him. Now they're in their K-Pack jackets. He says what he would do is he would lift his legs up to his chest. So he'd lift his legs up to his chest and he would just close his eyes and pray, because you're seeing this thing. He says that shark would go right underneath him. If he didn't feel the water rush by from the shark, he would feel the fins would hit him. And these fins, every time the shark had touched any of their skin, it was ripping sores into them easier than anything else. The salt water had been eaten into these boys' skin. It ate the hair off of some of the men. It was doing different damage to the different boys, but it was a toxic mix. You don't want to be sitting in seawater days on end like that, especially without any clothes, because some of these boys had some of the worst saltwater ulcers you could imagine, running up to the size of basketballs on them, and anywhere that the K-Pack jacket touched was always worn away. So the men had their own wounds. Some little fish would come and eat off of the wounds as they were sitting in the water. Tiny fish, not big fish, but they'd come and they'd nibble on it was just a terrible condition for their bodies. And this is how they went. And Edgar Harrell, through all this lifting up his legs, and this would go on through the whole attack cycle, he would be lifting up his legs over and over, and his stomach muscle would give way to where he couldn't lift his legs anymore, and now the sharks are just ramming his legs as they're going by. He can't even lift them up. It turns out that he had some major surgeries he had to go through because it developed some fattiness, some fatty tissue in places that it shouldn't be, around his stomach and around his colon, because he kept doing that. And you know, you keep doing that over and over and something's going to come out of it. And he had to have some pretty significant surgeries later on in life because of that. Well, it's Tuesday night. The shark attacks are continuing. The sharks are going through. Men are trying to cover their ears in the swimmer group to not have to hear the screams of the men. You'll be sitting there and all of a sudden a piercing scream will come out. A man will disappear, and sometimes he'll pop back up, sometimes he won't. Some men would cover their ears to not try to hear it, and all of a sudden they'd see a larger shark grab somebody at the surface and just take them all the way across the surface with them in their mouth as the man is screaming his head off. So it was just torture. Even if you aren't bit, you have to witness all your friends being eaten. One gentleman woke one morning and he went and I believe it was L.D. Cox, and he went to nudge his friend, and his friend flipped over, and the whole bottom of him was eaten all the way up to the edge of his life jacket. So there was no way to stay away from them. Like I said, they were going up into the nets in the Red Main group. And it's Tuesday night, and all this is going on. They finally get through with it. The sharks are done with their feeding, and they swim down out of the way. The men are just hysterical. Some of them are just fearing these sharks, fearing everything going on. They're in the Lewis Haynes group. Haynes is in with those 200 men that he's with, and suddenly, in the middle of the night, early morning Wednesday, so you know, just after midnight on Wednesday morning, somebody else get the Jap. Somebody saw a Jap. So get the Jap. And now Lewis Haynes is sitting there and he can see the flash of blades. They all carry knives, many of them carry knives, there's knives out. And in a matter of 15 minutes, 50 sailors are dead from each other. They just killed each other in a mass hallucination. There was Japanese with them. 50 men of the Haynes group are gone out of the 200, and now that group is no longer a group. Everybody is all worried about each other. They're keeping their distance from each other. Even Lewis Haynes, he swam away, and he swam himself away knowing that sharks were around, knowing that he was in danger doing it, but he wasn't going to be stayed by people that are out there killing each other thinking that everybody's a Jap. And plus, nobody can see who anybody is. You're all in oil, which doesn't help the situation. So he swims off, and now he's getting hit with his first bout of delirium. He starts almost crying, telling people, quit splashing me in the face. And when he turned around and got his senses back, he noticed it was these waves, the water hitting him in the face. He thought somebody was continuously splashing him. So he had started losing his wits, and all of a sudden he stopped being able to swim. And you feel like you're going to drown because it's 2 days in. These K-Pack the jackets are so waterlogged now that your chin is right at the water. And when you're not kicking, you kind of think you're going to drown, and he screamed for help, and he thought he was going to drown. And just then he was grabbed by somebody, and it was John Smook, the pharmacist's first mate, and he brought him over to his group, which was one of the smaller groups in the 400-man group that was left. And they had cohesion in their group, and their men were also going crazy, but they weren't going crazy killing each other. They were going crazy wanting water, accusing others of saying, hey, you have water. That's what was going on in their group. But it was much more survivable than the 200 men that started taking out knives and going at each other thinking they were a Jap. And Dr. Lewis Haynes with John Smook with his arm through the opening in the back of his jacket and him resting on his hip, Dr. Lewis Haynes was able to get a few hours of sleep. In the swimmer group, Dr. Lewis Haynes had to watch as the boys started drinking water. They would drink it sheepishly at first, and then they would start gorging on it. And they were setting off a chain reaction that was going to end in nothing but their death. At first they'd be normal, they'd be speaking normal, and then they would get a little clouded, and then they would get the strength of 10 men. They would do spinning in the water. They would just do all kinds of craziness before they shorted out. Their brain would sort of short out, and they would just fall limp. A lot of them would fall on their back in the water, and they would just do some moaning as they were swimming around or just floating around waiting for the last breath to come, but they were already finished off. Dozens of boys in that group had drank it, and boys in the raft group were also drinking the water. Richard Redmayne on Wednesday ended up drinking some salt water, got himself a case of delirium, and Harlan Twibble ended up knocking him out, tying him to his own jacket, and kept him alive that way until rescue, which was coming in the next 2 days. The salt water ended up killing probably more than a knife fight did when they lost 50 men in 15 minutes. Dozens of boys were drinking, and then as soon as you start drinking it, that's the end. There's nothing but a large amount of fresh water can solve that problem to save you at that point. If you don't get inundated in fresh water, once you drink that much salt water, you are finished. Dr. Haynes knew this. He knew the processes they were going through, and there was nothing he could do about it but watch. Wednesday morning comes around, and Dr. Lewis Haynes looks around him, and instead of seeing a large group of men, he sees a bunch of individuals. They're sitting in the water in their jackets with their chins dangerously close to the water, and most are sleeping, or at least he hopes they're sleeping. He'll swim over to them and start rousting them. Most of them wake up, a few of them don't. Gets them awake. He's going to start trying to round them back up into a group, and he gets hit by a second bout of a little bit of delirium. He sees the first shark he's seen since he's been in the water here on Wednesday morning, and it's about a 5-footer, and he gets this urge to kill it and drink its blood, so he starts swimming at it, and the shark turns and swims away from him. So he just turns around and goes back to this. There's a line of about 25 men that he notices, so he goes over to this single file line that he sees, and he asks the boy in the back, what's going on? And he says, well, there's a motel up front there, and they'll let you in and let you use the room, and you can sleep for 15 minutes in the bed, but you have to wait in line. And so he looks over, and even Dr. Haynes, as lucid as he is, says that he kind of could see a hotel on an island over there. And then the men were having just all sorts of hallucinations, whether individual or group. They had one boy trying to start an outboard motor on a boat. They had another boy trying to start his car. A group of 25 men decided they were going to swim to an island they passed up. They were mad that they passed up an island when they were drifting and they didn't go and visit it. So 25 men, including Ensign Moinello, who was one of the men that would herd the swimmers together with Park and Father Conway. He was in this group, so he had lost his mind and swam off to his death with 25 others. Another boy had said that other men said that they saw islands, they saw airstrips on the islands that the planes were supposedly passing up and not going to. Other men said that they saw the Indianapolis coming at them on top of the water, and still others said that the Indianapolis was right below them, below the surface. And again, Haynes had looked down and said he swore he saw the ship there with the lights on, the flag flying just below the surface, just underneath them. Boys started diving down. They would come up to the top of the water and they would tell the others, hey, the scuttlebutt is open, which is their water fountain they love to drink from. The scuttlebutt is open. The gadunk is open, which is their ice cream parlor. Hey, everything's down there. Men were diving down to their deaths in dozens now after these things, swimming off by themselves. Hallucinations were running the day in the swimmers group. They even had a gentleman swam over to Lieutenant McKissick, Charles McKissick, and he was in one of the smaller groups, not in the 200-man group. He was in one of the smaller groups, and this gentleman told him that he had been to an island that had a dock, and the woman had water there and she had drinks there, but that because he wasn't an officer, he couldn't be there. He couldn't get the drinks and he couldn't get the food. So this kid went up to Lieutenant McKissick and told him the story, and McKissick thought about it, and then he said, all right, and they started to swim over there. Well, on their way to going to this supposed island that had these drinks for him, they ran across the group that had Dr. Lewis Haynes in it, and Lewis Haynes and Lieutenant McKissick started talking, and McKissick told them there's an island over there, and this kid has been there, and tells them the whole story, and Haynes says it just sounds like another hallucination to me, but he didn't care. He swam off with the kids, so now there's another one gone. On Wednesday in the Red Main group, the Red Main Twibble group, things are getting out of hand. Not to mention the shark attacks they have to go through, but the petty officer second class had talked his way up onto a raft, saying that his eyes were hurting, and as soon as he got up there, him and some cohorts of his started eating the food, and I guess drinking the water, but I'm not sure that the water was good. I don't think they were drinking water, but definitely eating the food. And Harlan Twibble had swam over along with Ensign Bloom to get it away from them. They were too weak to be able to do anything about it now. And Redmayne had noticed this and he just waited it out. At McVeigh's group on Wednesday, more of the same, some fishing going on. They were parched. They didn't have any water. The water was no good. McVeigh had tried it. They had their malted milk balls, but that made you more thirsty. So that didn't help the situation. Shark kept taking their fish that they would catch. So a young man had a makeshift knife with a 1-inch blade on it, and that shark kept circling. John Spignelli could see him staring at the shark the whole day. And finally the guy, as the shark came close one time, jumped out and slammed it, stabbed it right between the eyes with the knife. And now cannonballs from the tail of that 12-foot oceanic white tip are going off as it's going crazy. It starts slamming the water with the tail, it starts hitting the raft with its tail, and it could break the raft up. Spignelli's got a young daughter at home. He's not happy with the guy for doing this. They haven't been bothered by sharks the whole time, and now this guy stabs that shark in the eyes. In the swimmer group, Jack Cassidy came eye to eye with a tiger shark he had nicknamed Oscar, and he sunk his 1-inch knife blade into that thing's nose, and it swam off. On Wednesday in Giles McCoy's raft, they had cut themselves loose of the 4-man rafts the day before, and now they're on their own, still within sight of the other rafts, but they're not banging up against other rafts. He's standing there, and all of a sudden Willis Gray, one of the four other men in his raft, stood up on the side of the raft, looked both ways, and dove into the shark-infested waters. McCoy looks over the side, sees all the sharks, sees him swimming, and he dives in. Swims out to him, grabs the kid, swims him back to the thing, puts him up over the side, and he goes down through the hole in the bottom of the raft and gets back in. Slams the kid against the side of the thing, says, "What are you doing? Don't do that again. Don't go out there again. There's no way." He's already tired from swimming out there to get him. And as soon as McCoy rests himself back down, Willis Gray gets up there again, looks both ways, and jumps back in the water. Now he looks and he jumps back in, and now he goes over and grabs him and yanks him back to the raft and puts him in there. And now he's yelling him, smacks him in the face, telling him, "Why are you doing that?" The kid's delirious, crying, saying, "Stop hitting me." And as this is going on, he looks behind him, and Ed Payne now is standing on the raft on that side. He looks both ways and he dives in. Robert Brundage is the only other one that is actually coherent in the raft. Felton Outland is in the raft too, but he's out cold because he got stung by a jellyfish that happened to get him and nobody else that was in the raft. So Robert Brundage looked at McCoy and says, "You just going to leave him out there?" And McCoy says, "I got no more fire." So Brundage jumped into the water, kicking off the sharks to keep them away as he grabbed that kid and grabbed Ed Payne and brought him back and put him into the raft. Finally, they had him all set, and this brought Giles McCoy to he finally admitted to himself, "I'm going to die. Nobody's going to rescue us. I'm going to die." And it changed his whole perspective on everything. He decided to jump overboard. He took off his shirt, jumped overboard, and he wanted to be clean when he died. So he jumped overboard, and he tried to rub himself off with all the water. Even with the sharks down there, he didn't care. He was trying to clean the oil off himself. Didn't use his shirt. Then he took off his shirt and tried to use the shirt. Then he gets back on board and he's trying to wipe himself clean, and he's still full of oil. He probably didn't clean any of it off. And Robert Brundage looks at him and says, you stupid thing." He said it again, "You stupid thing." And McCoy liked that. McCoy just wanted to be clean when he ended up dying, and he didn't want to have any problems with it, and he felt much better now that he admitted he wasn't going to be rescued. Thursday, dawn breaks with all the men scattered in the water, some of them with their wits about them, most of them that are in the water as far as the swimmers without them. They were having trouble with reality. They were still having their hallucinations. Probably another night of the teeth chattering cold and hypothermia and hypernatremia, and now they're into their photophobia daytime again, so they're going through all these different phases from day to night, not to mention sharks, which they probably can't even realize are going on anymore. And they're on a mission to nowhere. They're still swimming around aimlessly, most of them. Other swimmers that were exerting their energy the day before with all their hallucinations, they could barely move. So they're just like sitting in the water. And now they're sitting even lower in the water. Some of them are up to their chins or closer to their mouths when they can't kick their feet because they're so tired. And about 11 o'clock in the morning, Commander Chuck Wynn has his plane, and his antenna keeps coming out of its socket and it's banging around as he's flying. It's early in the morning, and he had taken off for sub hunting. He was a sub hunter, and he had taken off for a sub hunting trip, and the antenna acted up. He flew back, thought he had the antenna fixed, and took off again. Now he's up over the ocean, and the antenna starts smacking around again. Not only is it smacking around, but you can't make communications with the antenna not secured. So he brings the plane down from the normal 30,000 feet plus down to about 5,000 feet so that him and the men can go down there and deal with the antenna. While they're dealing with the antenna, one of the men down by the bubble at the bottom of the ship looks straight down, which is the only way you're going to see a person in the water. When you look to the side, you're going to see reflections of all the waves. You aren't going to see anything but the sun's reflection off the water. But if you're straight over it, you can see oil or people. And sure enough, this guy looked down and saw an oil slick, what he thought was an oil slick. Mentions that to them. Chuck Wing gets up into the cockpit, and he brings them down to 300 feet and comes over them, and he can't believe what he sees. He sees men covered in oil, all over this slick. He counts them up, and at first he estimates them between 35 and 70. He makes a coded message back to headquarters that he found up to 70 people in the water. Now they're thinking that this is a submarine that went down. All of a sudden, after about 10 or 15 more minutes flying around, he ups his estimate to 150 people in the water. And now that's no sub, that's a bigger ship, and they can't understand what was sunk there. Adrian Marks, flying his 5A Catalina, and George Atterbury are two of the planes that had showed up. Adrian Marks showed up a little bit before Atterbury, and Chuck Gwynn in his plane took him on a tour, told him wait to drop your provisions until you see the whole area. So he took them to the whole area all the way around. Took 20 minutes for them to fly around the whole area the men were spread out on. And Marks decided to drop his equipment to the singled out men that weren't with the group, that were by themselves. So he drops his equipment, and now his commander, George Atterbury, gets there, and Marks takes him on a tour of the stuff, and Chuck Gwynn heads out before he runs out of fuel. Atterbury goes around and he's looking at everything. Now these planes are under a no landing in water order. They're not allowed to try landing in water, especially Mark's squadron. They had lost too many planes trying. The swells were pretty big, about 10-foot swells going on. They were, you know, light rolling swells, nothing major. But he was going to land his plane regardless of what the orders were. Chuck Gwynn had ended up seeing, it must have been Chuck Gwynn that saw it because it's an asterisk in a couple of books. But he saw in a matter of 15 minutes 30 sharks tear up 60 men that were on a floater net, just gone, just ate them all. So 60 men lost their lives in a matter of 15 minutes to 30 sharks. And that must have been because they started celebrating and moving around when they saw the shark, when they saw the plane. That kind of activity will do that with the sharks. And that led Marks to land more than anything. He saw people being harassed at the time by sharks, but he had also heard that 60 men were eaten by sharks, so he landed his plane. Now, he landed it, and it was taking on water, did a little bit of damage to the plane, but he still had his props working, so he was able, with Atterbury above him, Atterbury was telling him where to go, and he was picking up individual survivors, and he picked up over 50, almost 58 survivors. He had them all in his ships, and then they were tying them to their wings, up on top of their wings, to keep them out of the water and out of the sharks' area. Probably saved a good 58 people doing that. They were in bad shape as it is, and he was picking up the single survivors. Many of them had no clue who they were. One of them being Charles McKissick, one of the earliest people that got onto the boat. He was with Edgar Harrell in the group. Well, Edgar Harrell and the group kind of broke up the night before. On Wednesday night, Edgar Harrell ended up floating off by himself, and his friend Spooner got separated from him. McKissick ended up leaving there probably with his kid and swam over to the area with the island where a couple of the kids dove down to go to the island, and McKissick's swimming around waiting for them to come back so he can go down and drink. Before they ended up coming back, the plane came over and dropped a raft over by McKissick. And he's swimming over to the raft and he's looking at it kind of puzzled, and he's about to touch it, and somebody said, "Don't touch that." And he says, "Why not?" And he says, "Because it's a mail drop. It's an experiment. It's just the government doing a mail drop." And he didn't want to go to jail, so he said, "All right," and he swam away from it. These people were not in their right minds when they were rescued. Some were. One guy that the Catalina pulled up to, said, "Hey, let me up on that nice little PBY you have there." That's what a Catalina is. So he was with it. And many others had their wits about them, but so many didn't. It was just ridiculous. They get them on board, they're throwing up, they have diarrhea. The plane must not have been a very pleasant place to be. But thank God for Adrian Marks. He got 58 of those people out of a very bad situation, and that was the beginning of the rescue.